Hey everyone, welcome to our last quarantine video of Pride. I'm Amy, I use she, her, hers.
And I'm Mitch, and I use he, him, his pronouns. So today, June 28th, is the 52nd anniversary of what is known as both the Stonewall riots or the Stonewall Uprising. And so we're super excited to dive into some of that history and chat about it.
I just remembered something. I have a piece of history from Stonewall. I'll be right back.
Okay, she's off and running. And so my question for this week that she'll be answering as well when she gets back is, where were we when we first learned about Stonewall? So for me, I had said when we were prepping for this this video, hello, welcome back.
Hello.
I was taking a Gemini course, which meant that I got high school credits and college credits in high school for U.S. history. And so I was a sophomore in high school. No, junior. I was a junior in high school. So this was the 2010 to 2011 school year. So I was 16, probably in there somewhere. Anyway.
If you were a junior, you were probably like 16, 17.
I graduated at 17, so I was probably 15, 16. I know. Baby
I
child.
also did. Can't give you that much of a hard time.
Late birthdays. It's like that. My birthday is the cutoff date. Anyway, it was in the textbook because it was a collegiate level textbook. I think it's what the difference was. We didn't talk about it in class. Like, nobody, it wasn't part of the curriculum or anything like that, but it was there, and I was the nerd who read the whole textbook because I love history. And so that was the first time that I ever even heard of it. But it was a paragraph in a college level textbook in 2010, 2011. Yeah.
So it's really interesting to hear you say that because I also took the Gemini history course at my school, but I went to a private Catholic college, but also a Catholic high school. And I was also a nerd, and I just read the whole history book. And I don't remember there being anything about Stonewall in there. I don't know if maybe we got different books because of our
funny
curriculum.
About this to us, yeah, like we were talking about this, what's funny about this to us is this was the same course in the same county, in the same state, from the same institution, and we had different books.
Yeah, so I don't remember there being anything about Stonewall. I could be wrong. It's been 11 years since I graduated high school, so it's been 12 or 13 years since I read the book. I don't remember there being anything in my book.
Well, like I said, it was one paragraph.
Right, so my answer for this is I didn't learn about Stonewall until I was like 18. It was the summer between my freshman and my sophomore year of college. And I was working at Becky's shop, Woman Made Products in Seneca Falls. Becky is who printed our shirts for us for Pride. I've talked about her before.
Proud sponsor.
She is a proud sponsor. I've talked about Becky before because she was also very instrumental in me finding myself on my journey, through me just spending time with her and her wife and her shop. So I learned about Stonewall by working at Woman Made Products. And that's really how I started sort of ingratiating myself more into understanding the history and then eventually figuring out my identity journey. I truly do not remember if it was in my book.
Yeah. I wish I still had that book. I definitely don't.
So, my
piece of history.
Piece of history. This flag was attached to the gate right outside of Stonewall on its 50th anniversary of Stonewall happening. Sarah and I were going to St. Martin the next day, so we wanted to go see the Stonewall, of course, and there were a bunch of flags attached to the gate all up and down like Christopher Street and all of that area.
Sheridan Square, yeah.
Yep, and so we snagged one because we were like, this is the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. We cannot leave without snagging one of these, and we got to watch the workers like I don't know what they're called, utility workers maybe, they were crushing up and heating up glass to make it a rainbow crosswalk while we were there. They were getting ready for Pride.
Oh, you watched them put that in.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
It was incredible. So we have this flag that we keep. We're actually, I think, going to put it in a shadow box so nothing happens to it.
Yeah.
But it's from the 50th anniversary of.
That's so
it was amazing.
I remember being on the hunt for the ideal Stonewall anniversary shirt because I really, really wanted one. And Central New York Pride, which is the amazing Pride organization out in Syracuse, they did their shirts this year that were the Stonewall 50th, and they say, "We are still here." And like I wore that shirt on Inauguration Day this year. Like that shirt I wear under like my dress shirts when I'm going into particularly tough conversations as an advocate, because it's such a comfort and such a reminder that we are still here and that look at what we've overcome.
That's amazing.
So it's hard to say really in exact words how meaningful this event is. And so we're really excited to talk about it.
Yeah.
So I've watched so many documentaries about Stonewall. Like everyone that I think they've ever made, I think I've seen. Some really whitewash the event and really only focus on cisgender white gay men, but that's not the reality of what Stonewall was, and that's not the reality of what our movement is. I tell people all the time, this community is not a monolith. We are incredibly intersectional and diverse.
Yeah. So really quickly, whitewashing, for those of you who've never heard that term before, it just means that people are rewriting history and removing people of color and their impact in those historical events. So when Mitch says that the history has been whitewashed in some of these documentaries, what it means is that some of the amazing people of color who were instrumental in Stonewall taking place have been sort of removed from that narrative.
Mm-hmm. Like on Christopher Street, there is a monument to the Stonewall Uprising. That is a gay couple and a lesbian couple. The statues, have you seen those? They were there. Mm-hmm. And they're literally white plaster. And some people have voiced, understandably, like some upset with that, because that, whether or not it was intentional, we can't say. But intent versus impact, the impact of that erases a huge part of the history. Mm-hmm. But it's really important, I think, for people to remember the very foundation of what Stonewall was, which was an illegal bar run by the mafia. Mm-hmm. Because in 1969, it was illegal for people to dance with people of the opposite sex. If you were wearing clothing, you had to be wearing at least 3 visible pieces of clothing aligned with the expectation for your assigned gender at birth, or you were getting arrested. So
drag queens got arrested
all the time. Specifically, drag queens were the ones that those laws targeted. And so I remember there's this one documentary where one of the queens who was at Stonewall says, well, you know, you've got maybe an undershirt in there and like maybe you wear briefs, but anything else is going to ruin the outfit. And it's funny, and like I love the resilience in our community that we laugh at that, but imagine like every weekend going to jail in the paddy wagon. That's what was happening. And so there were these very cyclical raids on the bar to arrest people for dancing with people of the same sex, or, you know, for the clothing. And so the mafia who ran the Stonewall would bribe the police.
So the interesting thing about how the mafia even became involved with the Stonewall is that the Stonewall started off as a straight bar, and then in 1966 the mafia bought it for $3,500, and it became a way for it was like a mutually beneficial arrangement that the mafia would do their underground work at the Stonewall and would run it as a gay bar so that LGBTQ people in New York City could come together in this place.
And they did it to capitalize on that, mind you. Like, it was very much a another extension of running an illicit operation. The Stonewall Inn did not have running water.
So there's a reason for that. It was a very particular type of bar that you could run. It was a bring your own liquor operation. So because of that, they didn't have to have running water. They could water down the drinks as much as they wanted to. They didn't have a liquor license. People had to bring their own liquor. And that is how the mafia was able to run so many things out of the eye of other people, is because they weren't getting checks on them the way that true and real bars and restaurants were being run and being inspected.
Because places that were for the gay community weren't supposed to exist, and the ones that did weren't real. Like, that was very much the attitude at the time. And so it's really important to understand that this is the context in which people began to push back. So Washington Square Park is very near to the Stonewall. And at that time, people who were present the night of the Stonewall riots recall that there was a community of like 40 or more homeless LGBT youth that they had been kicked out of their homes. They'd come from all over the country to New York to try and just like have a new life. And so they were going to the Stonewall every night. They were building a community there and getting to know people, and then they would sleep in the park. And in the park it was considered like very safe because there was a community specifically of LGBTQ people. They felt safest there rather than trying to rent, because you could be legally evicted or not rented to at any time. So even if you got a place, you could not be hired for a job if you were known to be gay. So they didn't have things like jobs or the ability to rent places mostly. But even if they did, if they could get them, they could lose them in a second, because there were no legal protections.
Yeah. I mean, we talk all the time about the fact that we only just got those legal protections last October.
For New York State. Federally, the Equality Act is sitting right now. That is the law that will federally give gay, transgender, and lesbian, bisexual, but even perceived people. Like, that's the thing that I think is really important to understand. If you are even perceived as being those things, federally, you can still be evicted or fired from your job for just being perceived that way, whether or not it's true. And it's going to be that way until the Equality Act is passed. So, pass the Equality Act. Anyway. But there's one activist whose name is Carla J, who I brought up at Trivia Night.
Yes, you did.
And so she is in a documentary about Stonewall. She's in a few. And she says that in Washington Square Park, like, there was like a feeling that change was coming in this community, that people were starting to say, hey, this isn't okay. Like, we're just trying to have a good time. We're just trying to dance with each other and find a way to survive. And the cops are coming and sweeping us up.
So cops would randomly run raids like once a month leading up to the uprising itself. But there were informants in law enforcement, in the police, that would tip off the mafia bar runners. But similarly,
it had been escalating out of an effort to try and, quote, clean up New York City.
So, yeah, they were rising and rising. Just before the uprising at Stonewall happened, they had been raided just a few days before that. And in the weeks leading up to the uprisings, 4 other gay bars were raided and shut down. So there was definitely a tide change in the area, in the community, and it was becoming very apparent that things were starting to happen.
Because when the police would see people at the bar, even if they weren't arrested, parents were called, schools were called, employers were called, and told this person was seen there, which we have protections against that now. But it very much was an attempt to control, but it was because of the events at Stonewall that the Gay Liberation Front actually organized in New York City. So it was June 28th, 1969. It started out as a regular old night at the Stonewall, and the police came to do their raid, and people pretty much got used to this. Like, they were used to pulling their IDs out, they were used to being prepared to be arrested, and there's all different perspectives on how the events transpired from there. Some people say that people were picking up bricks and throwing bricks. Some people say that shot glasses were being thrown. But basically what ended up happening is the people who were being arrested called to the rest of the crowd, "Why aren't you doing something?"
So, speaking of different perspectives, and a lot of different documentaries I watched or things that I read about it, it was specifically one gay woman was being forced into a cop car, like, really violently.
The paddy wagon, yeah.
Yeah, and she was like, "Why aren't you doing something?" And that's when people started throwing pennies and bottles, and that's really what started the throwing of things. So it's really difficult to sort of figure out exactly what that catalyst was, but the basic understanding is that everyone at the same time was like, "We're not doing this anymore."
Mm-hmm. So the cops actually barricaded themselves inside the Stonewall. Like, this was the first time that the police were afraid of what they called the Queens, what they called all kinds of other terrible names that I'm not going to repeat. It was very much a joke, and the power and control dynamic was, we've already covered, very out of whack. But this uprising, these riots, continued for 5 nights in the Stonewall and up and down Christopher Street.
Yeah.
So who are some of the people that were there?
So the ones that we always want to make sure we're calling attention to is Marsha P. Johnson, and that's these are the people we're talking about when we're saying that history is being whitewashed. Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, these people who were incredibly instrumental for a lot of different reasons. They're super historical figures, and we lose sight of that. One of the, I don't remember his name, but there's one guy who's a white, I believe, cisgender man who's credited as being the catalyst, and he was like, "I just happened to take a brick that somebody handed to me. Like, I'm not the one who did the call to action." I don't remember his name, Brian something, I think. But he had been interviewed a lot of times, and he was like, "I was just given a brick. I was given a brick by somebody else. Like, I'm not the person who deserves the credit for this."
Well, and now the historians are saying there weren't bricks. Like, it's so back and forth, and it was such a large crowd, and it was not safe for many, many, many people to be identified. I think that's why we missed so many names. And I think we lost a lot of the people who were present during the AIDS crisis, which we touched on in a previous video this month. But Stormé DeLavery was there. She is cited in some examples as being the woman who was calling for help while being arrested. And many more people whose names I am not calling up right now, but it was a community effort, and it was the whole community. Like, Carla J was there, who I previously mentioned. It was something that they did together. It was standing up and saying, "No more. We're not going to keep doing this. This has been going on for too long." For some people, it was as simple as, "We're just trying to dance." But for other people, it meant their whole lives. And that's the important difference. It's like, some people look at, "Oh, we're just trying to dance," as being really flighty. But even that, when you're legally not allowed to be with the person you love in public, that's fundamentally cruel.
Well, and even now we talk about, so we work with with some homeless youth sometimes, and we have people from cities who reach out to us. And one of our pieces of recommendation for building a safety plan is find your nearest drag show, find your nearest gay bar, because even if you're too young to drink, if you go in there and you say, I'm not here to drink, I need help, our community is going to swoop you up and get you put back on your feet. And so for a lot of people, a lot of homeless youth were coming to New York City. A lot of homeless people were already living in New York City, and they were going there not to be drinking, but to be with their community who they knew could help keep them safe in a way that they couldn't do on their own.
This is still very, very real. When I was going through my own coming out process and I was meeting with a crisis counselor because my mental health was not in a good place in 2014, the crisis counselor told me to pack up and go to New York City because I wasn't going to get the support I needed. I wasn't going to, everyone was going to reject me. I needed to just pack up, say goodbye to everything, and go to New York. That's still a thing that a lot of people do because it's seen as being easier to be LGBTQ in the city.
And in some ways it might be, but there is always that, if I go to the city, great, I know that inherently there are more LGBTQ people visibly out there, but if we continue leaving the cities, then we're not having community here, and we have to, we're making those difficult choices of if I'm leaving my family or my friends or the roots that I put down here. And, so for me personally, when I was coming out, I didn't have the fear of losing my roots. I mean, of course I had fear in and of itself just because it's a scary process to go through, but my roots were very soundly here. And so if I had just packed up and gone to a city preemptively, that would have caused a lot of damage to me and to my family. And so that kind of advice is always curious to me because there is always community. You just might have to work a little harder to find it. But again, that's why Mitch and I are here, so that you don't have to work that hard to find it.
I always say that I'm committed to being queer right here. This is my home, and this will continue to be my home, and we're going to make it a safer place for the people like us because we're everywhere. We're everywhere. We're part of humanity, and humanity is everywhere, so that means we are too.
Yep.
But so the thing about Stonewall that is really important is, even with all the confusion and not really knowing exactly what happened, it was a turning point. It was a catalyst for organization to fight for, and there are two different ways of saying it, gay rights or gay liberation. And there is a very large difference between how those are interpreted. But it was organized the next year on the anniversary of Stonewall. So this was June 28th, 1970, to have the Christopher Street Liberation Day March. So this was a march from Greenwich Village to Central Park, where people had signs proclaiming they were gay out in the daylight. People were together. Queens were in their outfits walking down the street through Manhattan. This was a big deal. And people who were on the sidewalks were being called to come off of the sidewalks and into the streets and joining the march. It grew as it went. And at first, they say that people were marching single file to make them look like a larger group than they were because there weren't that many. But by the time they got to Central Park, it was a huge amount of people marching, and it was parents of gay children in that march. It was allies to the community as well as members of the community. And it's important to have the context that this was when the Vietnam War protests were happening. This was right around the time that Kent State happened. So people were legitimately afraid for their lives and for their safety participating in that march.
The other thing about that, though, is that while people were afraid for their lives and their safety, people were also looking for the tides to change in a lot of ways. There were a lot of calls to action after Kent State and after Vietnam, and there were a lot of calls to action. in the 70s and the late 60s, and people were really ready for that change. And I think that this is an incredible means of taking that and turning it into something.
Yeah. So if you're watching this on any point after June 28th, last week, what we were able to do was show the documentary Cured, talking about how at this time homosexuality was actually classified by the American psychological psychiatric association as a mental illness. It was a diagnosis. It was something that electroconvulsive therapy was used, and all kinds of other coercive methods to try and remove it from people.
Well, and we just found out last night, last week, the night before we were recording this, that conversion therapy was practiced right here in our own backyard. We had no idea that until 1991, when it closed, it was being practiced here.
Yeah, and I knew this. I knew it in my bones, but I had never had the confirmation.
Mm-hmm.
And I have confirmation now, and I'm all kinds of incensed about it. But it's so, the events of that were in the 70s, the events of the fight to get this declassified. All of that activism, all of the work that has been done stemmed from Stonewall. This was the starting point. And I think for us and our generation, I know I myself always find myself very daunted by the enormity of the work and the amount of infighting and arguing there is in regards to how things should be and what's the top priority, because there's so much that needs to be addressed. But that was happening in 1972. So Sylvia Rivera, who we mentioned, she was actually, hugely involved in Stonewall, involved with organizing the Liberation Day March. Oh, also, quick side note, Brenda Howard, a bisexual woman, was one of the major organizers of the march. And I always like to plug that because she's considered one of the mothers of Pride, because this is what led to Pride.
Yeah.
Was these
this was the first
marches.
march.
Yeah, this turned into what we now know as Pride. But Sylvia Rivera was at the, I guess, like, final destination of the march, where they were giving speeches and calls to action, and people were intentionally blocking her from going to the stage. People were trying to keep her away from the stage because she was, and the term at the time was, a transvestite, and they didn't want, there was very much, and there still is in many ways, let us get our rights first and then we'll regard the trans community, which is why it's so important in modern day work to include trans people. But she did finally get to the stage to speak, and she gave a very, very powerful, she was mad, and understandably so, and there's video of her speech that day that you can actually see that is cut into a lot of these documentaries. But she was the only one that day who was calling to free the people who were incarcerated for being gay still, who was calling to protect those who had been impacted by violence and calling for resources to help the homeless. Like, she was the only person on that stage that day, people who were there claim, who brought attention to those really, really crucial needs that weren't being met. And then, so Sylvia and Marsha, from that point, that's where they formed their organization STAR, the Street Transvestite Action. What's the R? Street Transvestite Action.
I'll Google it while you continue.
Thank you. R stands for something. But I think it's really important to, I know I keep saying things important, all of this
Everything
is important to me. They really pioneered expressing the importance of intersectionality and, like, the need for, despite all of the differences in the community, us to do this work together, no matter what, because we are absolutely stronger together.
STAR stands for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries.
Revolutionaries, that's it. Yes, absolutely. So one of STAR's first activism real show outs was not long after the Liberation March. The New York University, we know as NYU, told students that they would only allow a dance where gay couples could dance together at the school if a psychiatrist would come in front of the school board and confirm that homosexual people weren't mentally ill and that it wasn't going to be a liability to the school. And they couldn't do that. So Marcia and Sylvia joined in with NYU students and they did a sit-in of the hall where they had planned on holding the dance. And I want to learn more information about that for sure, but that was in 71, and the fight to declassify homosexuality as a mental illness, we know that wasn't done until 1973, and even then the impact is still felt today. It takes a long time to unwind the impact of these decisions. And then in 1975, that was the first statewide LGBTQ march on Albany. Fun facts.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you hear all kinds of people reference Stonewall as that turning point. Like Edie Windsor she is no longer with us, but Edie Windsor talked about how scary it was for her and her partner, who were deeply closeted for their own safety, that this was going on, and they wanted to join, but they didn't want to risk losing their jobs.
Well, and so at the Stonewall, one of the ways that they managed to keep the Stonewall running during 1969 was they would have people, it was an elite exclusive bar, right? So they would have people be signing a ledger so they could prove that they were running an exclusive bar. Of course, people didn't sign their real names because they didn't want to be tracked. It wasn't safe. But, there were a lot of kind of elite gay people who were coming here, and it was held over them by the mafia that their names would be released.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, there was a lot of that fear because it was exclusive and it was anonymous, but it wasn't really anonymous, and it was very everybody was on tenterhooks all the time about their identity being outed. And so when we're talking about how revolutionary this is, it's incredible that we had so many amazing people stand up and do this, because there were no protections. It was absolute no man's land if you were queer. And so the people who did stand up and take the stand and work to change things so that we can be here today talking about it, that it can't be understated how important that was, because
it really was the jumping off point. Prior to Stonewall, there were gay organizations, including the Mattachine Society in New York City, and the Compton cafeteria riots had happened in California prior to Stonewall. But Stonewall was, I think, visible and large in a different way. And like I said, it wasn't just the events of Stonewall, but it was the coming back together the following year, coming out into the sunlight, really organizing and saying we're going to do this together. That is really what was the push forward. And so that was in 1970. Was that organization. In 1978, Harvey Milk was elected to office in California, the first openly gay person to be elected to public office. He was assassinated the same year he was inaugurated in. And that was a jumping off point. That was 1978. Gilbert Baker designed the rainbow flag so that there was a symbol of hope and a symbol of pride to march through the streets while remembering Harvey Milk after Harvey Milk was killed. So these things that they really built on each other. And Edie Windsor, who we talked about she talked about Stonewall and her activism continued, and Edie Windsor took the fight for marriage equality all the way to the Supreme Court. So,
well, there's that really famous picture of her with her marriage license and her partner.
Mm-hmm. So we're a part of a really long legacy, and in America, I think it's something to be so proud of. It is, to me, the quintessential American way of being, to believe in better, to have hope for better, and to demand better, and to work to make it a reality.
So I want to take it back to a little bit. We were talking about the difference between that fight for rights and that fight for liberation.
Mm-hmm.
So in speaking about how we have the amazing opportunity to continue these fights, and that we have so many incredible ancestors who have paved the way for us to continue these fights. Let's talk a little bit about that difference between rights and liberation.
So this is me speaking from my personal seat, my experiences, my certainly places of privilege. To me, rights are a concrete way of changing written laws, but there is a difference because rights can be taken away. We know that. A lot of progress was made prior to World War II for gay, lesbian, and transgender people. That was completely erased. Literature, research, changing laws, changing attitudes, gone. The work of 50 years was gone. And I think that's why the Stonewall 50th anniversary and where we are right now, I know I have a lot of very palpable anxiety, because if we could backpedal once, there's fear in me that we could do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And so liberation is a forever thing in my mind, right? So liberation is radical acceptance of the fact that we're all going to be different people, but we can come together to form our larger communities where we live, where we work, where we play. Liberation is feeling safe walking down the street, holding your partner's hand. Liberation is the knowing that your rights aren't going to be taken away. And so to me, that is the bigger goal, because that's what liberation means to me. What are your thoughts?
So in my mind, the way I see it, and poor Sarah has to deal with it all the time. I'm like, all right, I'm going to paint you a picture. But in my mind, what I see when I hear the word liberation is I just see chain links breaking apart.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that total radical freeing. And rights are things that people are entitled to but aren't necessarily granted. Mm-hmm. So, we talk all the time about there are inherent rights that we as humans have, but there are other humans that tell us, no, we don't deserve those rights. That liberation, like you were saying, is just, it's the full grant of our rights. It's the full guarantee of that safety, that radical freedom. And so when we're talking about liberation, and liberation is tied to really big historical freeings. Liberation in regards to slavery, liberation in regards to Auschwitz and the Holocaust. So liberation is to me an overarching theme of that radical freedom after huge suffering. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear that, that's why I just see chain links just shattering.
Yeah. Well, it's, we say that change happens when people are offered a seat at the table, but instead of filling one seat at a table, liberation is building a table that's big enough for everyone to have a seat at. That's
it's those community picnics that span blocks and blocks and blocks.
Yeah.
And that's what liberation is. It's just that radical freeing of saying, you are here, you belong here, and you deserve to occupy the space that you have.
Yeah. it's Thanksgiving at my great uncle's house where he would put plywood down on the pool table, and like the coffee table was seats for some people, and some of us who were brave would make a fire outside and sit outside and eat, but everyone was welcome. Everyone deserved to be fed. Everyone was loved. It's that unconventional, cobbled together maybe, but welcoming, and that's what to be truly free means to me, is to be welcomed, to be accepted, to be a part unconditionally.
Yes, and I love that imagery of like, it's cobbled together, but it's still us. Our community is incredibly diverse, and there are no real rules on how to belong in our community, because being LGBTQ, being queer, being whatever it is you use for yourself, that's how you live. Like, there is no one right way to be LGBTQ. And so, we were talking about planning weddings and how there are no real rules for planning a queer wedding, because you call the shots. Like, there's no tradition to it, so you get to make it what it is. There's no one way to live your life correctly, and there's no one way that you owe anybody to live that life. And so when you're talking about cobbling things together and like finding your place where you find your place, like, yeah, you find your place where you find your place, but you're always going to find a place to sit.
And problems get solved when we work together and we're creative in our solutions. I said this at the drag show. I was like, hey, if we're not taking what we've got and making it work, it's not pride. That's our legacy. That's what we've inherited as members of this beautifully diverse, completely non-monolithic community of people with different opinions, different beliefs. All of that is welcome, as long as foundationally we're being kind to one another. Like, that's the bottom line to me. And giving people their freedom to live their life as they know themselves to be.
So when we're talking about pride and why pride exists and why it's so important that it exists, it's because we are honoring the legacy of our ancestors who fought these battles so that we wouldn't have to fight these battles. Of course, we're still fighting battles today, but the groundwork was laid for us in such an irrevocable way that, I mean, you're not going to force us back. And I think that there's that beauty and that resilience of our community, is that even when we hit barriers, even when we hit roadblocks, we always find a way to build steps to get over those roadblocks. And then we're that higher up the mountain, right? And again, with my imagery, but
it's so President Obama, his second inauguration speech, I remember distinctly him talking about the American way of being from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall, like, and that was so profound at that time, because that was the first time that the fight for LGBT equality was mentioned in an inauguration speech. We talk a lot about firsts, right? In the community, there's a lot of that happening right now, like first transgender person to a Senate confirmed government position, Dr. Rachel Levine. First, what else are some of these firsts? I'm blanking. Anyway, but it's meaningful. It's something that we...
Well, and so when we're talking about firsts, we're also talking about the fact that we're having more queer people standing up and speaking openly about it. So, we've got all these people who are in politics now, who are demanding their space at the table and occupying it and doing something good with that, right? We're talking about these laws that are getting overturned. We're talking about people who are being willing to stand up in a way that hasn't historically happened. We're having people, celebrities, coming out at younger ages, which is amazing, because that means that our younger generation doesn't have to sift through dregs to find representation. No, I know JoJo Siwa was kind of a hot button for a lot of people, because a lot of them were like, well, I don't want my kid watching this anymore. But queer kids exist all over the place. And if we had JoJo Siwas when we were younger, I don't know that it would have taken me until college to figure things out about myself, right? We didn't have that representation. We talk about how we would go to Barnes & Noble and continue to go to Barnes & Noble with lists of books, yeah. Right? And it's a miracle if we find a couple. But they exist now in a way that those things didn't happen. And so it's crucial to remember that, like, yeah, Pride Month might be really loud and really bright, and a lot of people might get sick of hearing about it, and that's okay. It's okay to be tired. It's okay to get tired of hearing about it. But it's important to know why that's important, why it continues to be talked about, why it exists, and to understand that it doesn't come from needing to be special. It comes from needing to make sure that people remember that we have an incredible history and that those people deserve to be honored and that our ancestors deserve to be honored, and we deserve to occupy our space.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, speaking of change makers, we are finishing out Pride Month with an additional event that we just added that will be happening June 30th, this Wednesday at 7 p.m., which is a panel discussion of the new Hulu documentary Changing the Game that talks about trans student athletes. I will be on that panel. New York Times writer Jillian Brassil will be on that panel.
One of my dear friends, Lindsay, she works with college students, not just domestically, but internationally. So she'll be on there to talk a little bit about working with college students and high school students, getting them ready for college. So we're going to have a really amazing and diverse panel. I think we have a couple of local coaches who might be coming.
Might be joining.
We're not sure yet. We're still finalizing our panel, but...
And this is through our partners and friends at the Smith Opera House, the Smith Center for the Arts, who have really committed to making sure that Pride is observed. But speaking of, like, the change makers and people being able to come out younger and younger, have you watched the film yet?
I started it.
Okay.
I have to watch it in chunks.
Yeah, that was a big one for me too.
Yeah. But, you know, again, I don't mean to belabor this point, but I don't remember her name, but the cross country, the
Andrea.
runner, yes, who she just made it into the Olympics, and
I was talking about the movie. I don't know who you're talking about.
I'm talking
I know who you're talking about. Yes.
So I don't remember her name, but she has beautiful bright orange hair.
It's blue now.
It's blue now?
I think it was blue.
And it's orange because her...
Sha'Carri Richardson.
Okay, so she was like, my girlfriend chose this for me. She thought it was really vibrant and it would make me stand out. And I was like, cool orange hair. Also, girlfriend? Like, we're having people who are, like, unapologetically like, oh yeah, my girlfriend. Like, they're not even hiding it now.
When people who were gay were excluded from competing previously. Yeah. So it's a big deal because it's
amazing
progress. Yeah.
People aren't hiding it anymore. Mm-hmm. And that authenticity, I can't imagine what it would feel like for our wave makers at Stonewall to see the authenticity people live with today openly in spite of barriers. But I can't imagine what that would feel like for them.
Yeah. And I wonder, I often wonder, my first tattoo was the Harvey Milk quote, "You gotta give him hope," from his famous Hope speech that he gave pretty near to when he was assassinated. I can't wait for an opportunity, hopefully in another life sometime, to sit down and tell him what he did, to tell Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera that what they did had this ripple effect that gave us our freedom. It's powerful stuff.
It is. So, thank you so much for celebrating Pride with us this year. We had a blast. We love talking about history, obviously. We were like, oh, this video will be like 30 minutes. We're hitting 50 right now. So
it happens.
Thank you so much for celebrating with us. We are here all year round. We are not just here during Pride. I know we made a video a few weeks ago about all the different services we provide, but please remember that we are here For those of you who are seeking community and don't know where to look, come to us. We will help you. Yeah.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Keep celebrating, keep being authentic. These videos will be mostly, and a lot of our events too, were recorded and are available to watch when it fits into your life and your calendar. I know June is a very busy month, but we can't wait to see you, and we hope that you have had a wonderful Pride Month.
And we will see you at some point in the future.
Bye.
Bye.